The city was alive with music that night. The wide streets leading to the grand concert hall shimmered under golden street lamps, and the crisp evening air carried the faint hum of conversations and laughter. Black cars pulled up one after another in front of the massive marble steps, releasing guests dressed in elegance, glittering gowns, polished shoes, velvet shawls and suits that looked as if they'd been stitched by the finest tailors in Europe. Inside the hall, the chandeliers cast a warm glow on every polished surface, and the scent of old wood mixed with the faint trace of perfume and polished brass. This wasn't just any concert. It was the annual charity gala, an event where the city's most influential figures gathered to enjoy an evening of culture while raising funds for the arts. But tonight's highlight wasn't just the music. It was the star of the show, Alexander Voss. Alexander was not merely a violinist. He was a sensation, a child prodigy who had once stunned audiences. At age 9, he had grown into a man whose career was built on flawless performances and an unapologetic arrogance. Critics praised his mastery, but whispered about his cold demeanor, his habit of belittling other musicians, and his sharp tongue when speaking of anyone he deemed unworthy of the stage. He loved the spotlight, not only for the applause, but for the power it gave him, the control over every ear in the room. Backstage, Alexander adjusted the cuffs of his crisp black suit, the faintest of smiles curling on his lips. He thrived in moments like this. The program for the night was carefully crafted, a series of challenging pieces, culminating in a personal favorite, La Tempeste, known among musicians as one of the most difficult compositions ever written for the violin. It was a storm of rapid bowing, complex fingerwork, and demanding emotional depth. Alexander had tackled it countless times, and tonight, he planned to add a twist. The audience was buzzing when he finally walked onto the stage. The hall erupted into applause as he bowed, but there was a spark of mischief in his eyes that only a few in the front rows caught. He took his place, played a few opening pieces to perfection, and then, as if struck by sudden inspiration, he stepped toward the microphone at the edge of the stage. "My friends," he began, his smooth voice carrying easily to the farthest balcony. "Tonight is about art, passion, and perhaps a little courage. I propose something different, something that will truly test the spirit of music." The crowd leaned forward, intrigued. "I will play the most difficult violin piece in existence. But before I do, I would like to see if anyone among you dares to attempt it first." A ripple of murmurs spread through the hall. People exchanged glances. Surely, this was a joke. No amateur could hope to play La Tempesta. Even trained musicians often failed at its most demanding sections, but Alexander was scanning the audience, searching for someone, and then his eyes landed on her. In the very back row, away from the bright center lights, sat a woman unlike the rest of the crowd. She wore a simple cotton blouse, neatly pressed, but entirely devoid of glitter or silk. No diamonds sparkled on her wrists, no pearls adorned her neck. Her hair was tied back loosely, and she sat with quiet composure, as if she were there simply to listen, not to be noticed. Alexander's smile widened. Perfect. She would be the one. It would be amusing, perhaps even entertaining to watch her fumble through the impossible, providing a moment of light-hearted humiliation for the audience. "You there," he said, pointing toward the far corner. Every head turned to follow his gaze. "Yes, you, in the white blouse. Would you join me on stage?" The woman looked startled. A soft wave of whispers spread through the crowd. Who was she? Why her? She hesitated for a moment, eyes flickering from the stage to the people around her. Slowly, almost reluctantly, she rose from her seat. The path to the stage felt long under the weight of hundreds of eyes, but her steps were steady. When she reached the edge of the platform, Alexander extended his hand in a dramatic gesture, as though presenting a contestant in some grand performance. He placed his treasured Italian violin in her hands, its polished wood gleaming under the stage lights. It was worth more than most people earned in years, and it was clear he didn't expect her to handle it with any real skill. "This," he announced, turning to the audience, "is La Tempesta. Few dare to face it. Fewer still survive its storm." The crowd chuckled lightly, certain of the outcome. Alexander took a step back, folding his arms, his smirk barely concealed. But as she positioned the violin under her chin, something in her eyes changed. A quiet shift, a glimmer of focus that only those closest to the stage could see. The audience watched her with a mix of curiosity and mild amusement. After all, this was no small challenge. People trained for years to master even a fraction of La Tempesta. And here she stood, an unassuming woman plucked from the back row, holding an instrument that wasn't even hers. Alexander stepped aside, arms folded, his expression carved with the kind of smugness that comes from knowing the punchline of a joke before anyone else. The spotlights caught the gleam of the violin in her hands, its deep amber wood reflecting the gold glow from above. She took a breath, so slight that only the front row noticed, and then she lifted the bow. For a moment, silence reigned. The air seemed heavier, charged with anticipation. Her fingers brushed the strings lightly, testing them, feeling their resistance, mapping their tension like someone who'd done it before. This subtle familiarity went unnoticed by most, but not by a man in the second row, who leaned forward slightly, a puzzled expression on his face. Then, without warning, she began. The first notes sliced through the air like a clear, cold wind. There was no hesitation, no stumble, no timid testing of the waters. She dove straight into the rapid, complex opening sequence, her bow hand moving with a precision and speed that made even the seasoned musicians in the audience stiffen in surprise. Alexander's smirk faltered, just barely, but enough for those watching him closely to see. Her fingers danced across the fingerboard, every movement clean and intentional, like water flowing over smooth stones. The rapid triplets, the sudden shifts in pitch, the delicate but powerful vibrato. She handled them as if the piece had been written for her, and her alone. And yet there was no hint of showmanship in her posture. She wasn't performing for applause. She was simply playing. A hush fell over the audience. People leaned forward unconsciously, their earlier amusement replaced by fascination. Somewhere in the balcony, a woman gasped softly. In the third row, a young boy's eyes went wide, his mouth parting as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. Alexander, however, was beginning to feel a strange tightening in his chest. He had played this piece in front of royalty, in world-class concert halls, and every time he had commanded the stage. But now, watching this stranger, he realized something unsettling. She wasn't just playing La Tempesta correctly. She was playing it with a depth and emotion he hadn't heard in years. The middle section arrived, the part that weeded out even the boldest musicians. A series of abrupt tempo changes, lightning-fast finger stretches, and a bowing technique so demanding that most players left the piece behind altogether. She didn't falter. Her bow arm remained fluid. Her left hand moved with impossible speed, and her eyes stayed calm, almost distant, as though she was somewhere else entirely. The man in the second row tilted his head, recognition dawning in his gaze. He whispered something to the woman next to him, who looked equally startled. Meanwhile, on stage, Alexander found himself leaning slightly forward, without realizing it. The mocking script he had written in his head, where she would stumble and fumble, where the audience would laugh politely, and he would swoop in to rescue the moment, was disintegrating with each passing measure. The woman reached the piece's notorious storm passage, where bow and fingers moved in a frenzy, the violin screaming and whispering in rapid succession. Her execution was flawless. No more than flawless. It was alive. The sound swelled and softened like waves breaking against rocks, then retreating into stillness before crashing forward again. The crowd was utterly silent now, no longer breathing in sync with the music, but holding their breath altogether. The only sound was the violin, commanding, demanding, filling every inch of the grand hall. For Alexander, this was the moment the ground began to shift beneath him. He had spent years believing he stood alone at the summit of mastery, yet here was this unknown woman, no designer dress, no glittering name, scaling that summit without breaking a sweat. He didn't just hear her skill, he felt it, and deep down, in a place he would never admit to, he felt something dangerously close to fear. She pressed into the final stretch of the piece's second movement, the tempo intensifying, her bow a blur. Every note landed with deadly precision, yet carried a weight of emotion that pulled at the heart. Somewhere in the audience, a tear slipped down someone's cheek.
Alexander's arms unfolded, his hands now clasped in front of him, his jaw tight. He wasn't smiling anymore. He wasn't mocking her anymore.
And then came a particular phrase, one that every violinist knew was a near impossible leap from a high harmonic to a double-stop trill. Most avoided it altogether, replacing it with a simplified passage. She didn't. She hit it cleanly, effortlessly, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. The hall seemed frozen in time, the final echoes of her impossible leap still trembling in the air. A pin could have fallen and shattered the spell. Yet no one dared move. It was as if the audience feared that even the smallest sound might break whatever magic she was weaving. Alexander's eyes narrowed slightly, but it wasn't a look of anger. No, it was something far more complex. His mind, trained to dissect technique and tone with surgical precision, was scrambling to understand what he was witnessing. This woman wasn't just skilled. She was rewriting the piece with every stroke of her bow, bending it to her will in a way that few could dream of doing. Her posture was unshakable, her breathing perfectly aligned with the music's ebb and flow. The way she gripped the bow, relaxed yet decisive, betrayed years of muscle memory, and the way she slid into the softer passages with a feather-like touch made even the harshest critic in the audience lean forward involuntarily. The man in the second row now sat bolt upright, his eyes fixed on her face. He whispered again to the woman beside him, this time more urgently. She turned sharply to look at the stage, her expression morphing from surprise to disbelief. Alexander, however, wasn't concerned with the whispers. His own pride was on trial now. Every musician carried a quiet fear that one day someone would appear who could play not just as well as they could, but better. And here it was, standing right in front of him, in plain clothes, with no grand entrance, dismantling his carefully built reputation note by note. The next section of La Tempesta was less about speed and more about control. Sustained notes that required impeccable bow pressure, pure intonation, and an almost vocal quality. She played them not just with control, but with tenderness. Each note seemed to hold a story. Each vibrato pulsed like a heartbeat. It wasn't just music now, it was confession. The audience was visibly shifting. What had started as curiosity had grown into collective awe. Heads were tilted, brows furrowed, lips pressed together, the expressions of people who were feeling something they couldn't easily name. By now, murmurs had begun in the farthest corners of the hall. Not the distracted chatter of a restless audience, but the soft hum of speculation. Who was she? Where had she learned to play like this? Why had no one heard of her before tonight? Alexander's eyes flicked toward the conductor, at the side of the stage, who was also watching with a strange, knowing smile. The conductor's hands, which usually moved reflexively with the music, were still. He too was listening. Truly listening, as though he had stumbled upon a secret meant only for him. The woman's bow moved like an extension of her own arm. She didn't fight the violin. She coaxed it, persuaded it, breathed with it, and as the music built toward another tempestuous swell, there was a quiet moment, just a breath, where her eyes lifted slightly from the fingerboard and seemed to scan the crowd. For an instant, her gaze locked with the man in the second row. His hand froze mid-motion. The name he had been whispering now stuck in his throat. Alexander noticed the exchange and felt a small spark of irritation. Was there something going on here that he didn't know about? He had assumed she was just some random audience member, but the intensity of that look told him otherwise. The storm passage returned. Louder, faster, more dangerous than before. Her wrist flicked like lightning, the bow hair straining under the speed. The audience leaned back slightly, as though physically bracing against the sound. Yet even in the chaos of that section, there was clarity, each note distinct, each shift deliberate. Alexander's pulse quickened. He had played this very piece in competitions that determined his career, and never had he felt so utterly outclassed. This wasn't a duel anymore. It was an exhibition of dominance, and it was being done with the casual grace of someone who didn't even seem aware of the storm she was causing in the room. The murmurs grew louder in one corner of the hall. A few people began exchanging quick glances, some even pulling out their phones to record discreetly. Something was dawning on them, a realization that made the atmosphere even heavier with anticipation. She reached the transition into the final movement, where the melody becomes deceptively simple, a trap for the unprepared. Many players lost momentum here, but she leaned into it, letting the notes breathe, letting the audience catch the emotional undertow before dragging them back into the current. Alexander's lips parted slightly, as if to say something, but no words came. He didn't know whether to stop her, challenge her, or simply surrender to what was unfolding. And as she prepared to enter the piece's most dangerous closing sequence, her eyes lifted again, this time toward Alexander. But instead of intimidation or triumph, her expression carried something else entirely. Her eyes locked on Alexander, and for a moment, the music seemed to hang in the air, suspended between them. There was no gloating in her gaze, no trace of arrogance. Instead, there was something deeper, something that almost looked like recognition. Alexander's breath caught, though he didn't know why. He had seen thousands of musicians play in his life, but never had he felt this strange pull, as though the music itself was asking him to remember something he couldn't quite place. Then, with a slow inhale, she launched into the final, most treacherous sequence of La Tempesta. The notes came like a torrent, impossibly fast, yet perfectly clear, each one biting into the air and dissolving into the next. Her left hand darted up and down the fingerboard with surgical precision, while her right hand controlled the bow with the ease of a master. It wasn't just speed, it was artistry layered over control, the kind of playing that seemed almost supernatural. The audience was transfixed. Some leaned so far forward, they were perched on the edge of their seats. Others sat frozen, as if afraid to move. The man in the second row was gripping the armrest, so tightly his knuckles had gone white, his eyes wide, shimmering. Alexander felt a bead of sweat slide down his temple. He had played this exact run countless times, but never had it sounded like this. She wasn't just performing the notes. She was breathing life into them, turning the sheet music into a living, breathing storm. And then, as the music surged toward its final peak, she did something unexpected. She slowed, just barely, stretching the timing in a way that made the entire hall lean into the sound. Desperate to hear the resolution, it was risky. Any miscalculation and the effect would be lost. But she pulled it off flawlessly, landing the final sustained note with such purity that it rang through the hall like a bell in a cathedral. The silence afterward was deafening. For a few seconds, no one moved. It was as if the entire room had forgotten what applause was. Then a single pair of hands began clapping in the far back. Another joined, and within moments, the hall erupted in a thunderous ovation. The sound hit Alexander like a physical wave. He'd experienced applause before, standing ovations, cheers, but this felt different. This wasn't polite appreciation. This was the kind of response reserved for something rare, something unforgettable. The woman didn't bow right away. She stood still, her violin lowered at her side, her chest rising and falling with the controlled breathing of someone who had given everything to the performance. Then slowly, she tilted her head toward Alexander, as if inviting him to step forward. He hesitated, but curiosity won over pride. He took a few steps toward her, the applause still shaking the hall. "Who are you?" he asked under his breath. Almost drowned out by the crowd, she gave the faintest smile. Not smug, but knowing. "You wouldn't remember me," she said softly. "It was years ago. I was 13. You were judging the youth competition in Vienna. I didn't even make it past the preliminaries." Alexander's brows furrowed. The memory was faint, buried under years of performances and competitions. "That was you," she nodded. "I didn't have the right clothes. My violin was borrowed. You told me I had potential, but not enough to stand out." The words hit him like a sudden gust of cold air. He remembered now, a shy, quiet girl who had played with raw talent, but lacked polish. He'd written her off, as one of the many who would never make it to the big stage. "I wasn't ready then," she continued, her voice barely audible over the applause. But I learned. I practiced. Every day. Every hour. Until I could play this piece, not just to impress someone, but to own it. There was no bitterness in her tone, only calm certainty. The man in the second row suddenly stood, clapping harder than anyone else, tears in his eyes. The woman beside him finally recognized what he had been trying to whisper earlier, her face lighting with shock. They both knew her. Alexander felt a strange mixture of humility and awe settling in his chest. For the first time in years, he wasn't the one commanding the room, and yet instead of resenting it, he felt a quiet satisfaction, as if witnessing the very purpose of music itself. The conductor stepped forward and addressed the audience. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said with a wide smile, "you have just heard something extraordinary. Remember her name. You will hear it again." The ovations swelled again. Louder, longer. Some people stood on their chairs. Others shouted her name, as if trying to etch it into the air. The woman finally bowed. Not deeply, but with a grace that seemed to acknowledge every soul in the room. Then she turned to Alexander one last time, gave a small nod, and walked off the stage. As she disappeared into the wings, Alexander stood still, the echo of her final note still alive in his mind. And he knew, without a shred of doubt, that he had just witnessed a once-in-a-lifetime performance, and that the world would never forget her.